Well, I hope you all enjoyed the film and the refreshments, if you availed yourself of that. I've been asked to say that there is a DVD of that film available from Herald Print Shop, if anyone would like to watch it again. But now we come to the main event, at least you're all here. That's the talk by Professor Andrew Ray, who works for the University of the Highlands and Islands, based in Perth, and has connections with Orkney currently, being one of the main men in the work that's gone on at the airport in developing sort of sustainable fuels and other things to do with aircraft and so on. But he's here tonight, of course, to talk about rather longer ago and the first years of our air service in Orkney. So I'll leave Andrew to tell everything else.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Excellent. Does that work? I can't see anybody, there's a bright light there. Okay. So thank you very much for that introduction. Moya mentioned earlier on the word eminent. I think either she doesn't understand the meaning of the word or it means aviation geek as well, because that's what I am really at heart. I spent most of my early career designing airplanes for Airbus and Boeing before moving into academia. But I have always had an interest in the aviation sector in the north of Scotland. I'll explain why later. But the subtitle of the talk there is the impact and legacy of the creation of airline services in the north of Scotland. And that is linked through to the Sustainable Aviation Test Environment, and hence the logos here are the partners working on the project up at the airport and wider than that. And I'll touch on that at the end to show you how the work of the pioneers has helped to inform what we've done since then. So first of all, I should say thank you very much for coming out on such a beautiful evening. I will talk to an empty room about aeroplanes, but it's nice to have an audience as well. That's a bit of a bonus. So the things I want to cover this evening are the birth of aviation in Scotland, so the early attempts at flight, and then starting off in the Western Isles, followed by the Northern Isles. I'll start with the Western Isles because John Sword beat Ted Fresson to airline services by 3 weeks. So it's a slight advantage, but chronologically, I should start with the Western Isles. Then look at what happened with nationalisation post-war, some of the personalities, and then because I'm an aircraft designer, I'll talk about the aircraft, and then I'll talk about SATE and the future for aircraft in our region. Throughout, you might recognise some of these pictures. These are Edmund Miller's paintings that he did for Peter Clegg's series of books that he wrote about the various airlines in the north of Scotland. I had the pleasure of meeting Edmund Miller, and I have most of his paintings somewhere on my walls at home. And they are very evocative of the period. So, starting off with early aviation. And I should mention that what I'm about to talk to this evening is based on a chapter I wrote for a book by my colleague, Professor David Worthington, who's based down in Dornoch, called New Coastal History. The first draft of that chapter I wrote was apparently 6 times longer than it needed to be with the word count, so you're getting the long version tonight. But if you're interested in the book, that's it there. So the first reference to aviation in Scotland I could find is a guy called John Damien, who in fact was Italian and threw himself off the battlements of Stirling Castle, Icarus style, with wings made out of hen's feathers. When obviously gravity won and he hit the floor rather hard, he claimed that if he'd been given eagle's feathers, he would have flown. But I think we know exactly what would happen. Alexander Wilson, nearly 250 years later, did things more of a scientific nature when he used thermometers attached to paper kites to look at temperature variations with height. And then following the flight of the Montgolfier brothers in 1783, a guy called James Tytler flew, sorry about this contraption in Edinburgh, and there are several streets named after him around Holyrood, which is where he did his first flights. His first flight was about half a mile and got to a height of about 100 meters. But that was eclipsed significantly just a year later by another Italian, Vincent Lunardi, who flew 46 miles from Edinburgh to Fife. There is a plaque next to the road in the middle of Fife, and he's even mentioned in one of Robbie Burns' poems. And then 1815, this feat wasn't even closely repeated when James Sadler flew from Glasgow to Mulgai, which was less than a quarter of that distance. So moving on to things that looked almost like aeroplanes, a guy called Persson was interested in what we call Lilienthal type gliders. So Lilienthal was a German who had experimented with manned gliders and had achieved some significant work in improving how we understand mechanics of flight. But Pilcher left Glasgow University and started flying these type of gliders near Helensburgh and went to work for Sir Hiram Maxim down in Kent. And Maxim, you may be aware, invented the first repeating machine gun, but he also made a significant contribution to aeronautics. He designed a whirling arm on the end of which he placed aerofoils to test lift and drag. When he realized that that was limited, he then designed the first wind tunnel in the UK and came up with the shape that we know in modern wings, a cambered wing, which means it's curved from front to back. So that was all down to Hiram Maxim. While working for Maxim, Pilcher got the idea of these gliders and wanted to put an engine in it, and would have done so if he hadn't been killed in an accident in 1899. So there is a possibility that he would have beaten the Wright brothers to the first powered flight. But aviation is littered with if-onlys and maybes. So state-sponsored aeronautical science was centered around what was originally called the Army Balloon Factory at Farnborough, and a rather eccentric and flamboyant American called Colonel Sam Cody, who was a Wild West showman to begin with, joined Farnborough and started looking at man-carrying kites for observation, which he did in the Boer War. And he was joined at Farnborough by a guy called John William Dunn, who was the son of an army general, much more of an establishment figure and favoured by the hierarchy at Farnborough. And Dunn came up with, in aerodynamics terms, of pure aircraft. So his aircraft is here. It's a swept tailless configuration. So there's no tailplane at all. It's controlled only by ailerons at the tip of the wing. It was considered so advanced and so secret that it was transported the 500 miles north to Blair Athol, where it was flown successfully by the head of the RE as it became then. But John Dunn got disillusioned and he went off. He was good friends with H.G. Wells and wrote some books on the philosophy of time and other esoteric subjects, so he was lost to aeronautics, sadly. And then it was Cody that made the first controlled powered flight in the UK in 1908 at Farnborough. He walked away from the landing. The plane never flew again, so I guess it was a successful flight. But Cody was awarded that recognition. So not long after, Captain Bertrand Dixon was one of the first Scotsmen to be awarded a flight certificate. If you ever get a chance to read about Dixon, if you don't know his life already, I suggest you do. He's a fascinating guy. His grave is just beside the road between Garve and Gairloch, on the road for there, so that's his grave up here. And then not long after that, on the west coast, James Radley flew some demonstration flights in a Blériot-type aircraft at Pollock, and then in 1910, there was a large aviation meeting at Lanark. They had 200,000 spectators to look at over 20 different types of aircraft. and the Caledonian Railway had to build a purpose-built station at Lanark Racecourse to accommodate that. And it was the first proper aviation meeting where speeds and distances were recorded. And then arguably the first Scottish aircraft up to Montrose. And then most of you will know of Jens Trygve Gran, who flew from near Aberdeen to Norway in a Blériot-type aircraft again. 80 horsepower engine, 4.5 hours in an open cockpit over the North Sea. Rather him than me, but he did it. And his achievement is commemorated here by this plaque and by these public toilets here. I think the public toilets may be a later addition. So returning to military aviation, the first military accident happened in Scapa Flow, not far from here, with a Sopwith Bat, which is this aircraft top right, hit some debris in Scapa Flow, was repaired, then hit some more debris and was written off. Other notable Scots pioneers include John Gibson in his aircraft here, and then I said arguably the first Scot in a Scottish aircraft. It could have been one of the Barnwell brothers in this slightly oddly looking contraption. And certainly Frank, one of the brothers, later achieved success as one of the chief designers of the Bristol Aeroplane Company. And of course, Beardmore was going to mention, a very successful firm established near Clydebank. They achieved a license for building German DFW aircraft for the Royal Naval Air Service. And unique amongst these pioneers so far, they were the first to set up a design office for the design of their own aircraft. They built over 500 aircraft at Dalmuir, including the R-34. And that site is currently the site of the Rolls-Royce facility at Inisherin. So then moving on to the formation of the Scottish Flying Club, that was done by 5 ex-World War I military pilots who met repeatedly in Miss Cranston's tea room, which was the Macintosh tea room in Glasgow. It took them until 1927 to formally institute the club, but it was a forward-looking and inclusive club. And one of the people they gave support to was Winnie Drinkwater, who many of you will know about and more of later. But still, by the early 1930s, aviation in Scotland was really the domain of flying clubs and air taxis, and still seen as a luxury commodity before the airlines truly started. So, moving on to the Western Isles. This is one of Ed Miller's pictures of John Sword's airline across Renfrew. So it's created by John Sword, who is the well-built young man on the right-hand side at Renfrew. He was a director of the Scottish Motor Transport Company, the bus company. He established an airline to complement the bus service. It lasted only for 2 years because the bus service wanted him to return back to concentrating on buses. But in the process, it achieved the first scheduled airline service flight in Scotland on 18th of April 1833. So literally 3 weeks before, Ted Fresson did the same from Inverness to here. And 2 days after that, Winnie Drinkwater flew the first commercial service piloted by a woman. And I've not found anywhere in the world to beat that, so it could be a world first. If you know of any different, please let me know. We have the ubiquitous de Havilland Dragon behind it, and this is my grandfather, John Ray, who was one of his first pilots. He delivered, it was either this Dragon or one of the others, and John Sword offered him a job on the spot, and he took it. Not long after that, the first air ambulance flight was performed out to a fisherman who had a perforated stomach in Islay, flying him to Glasgow. And he recovered fully. 40 years later, this is John McDermott, the fisherman, with the 10,000th air ambulance patient, Mrs. Ann Heads with her baby. And this kind of ambulance or access to ambulance service created some novel community-based activities. So in Campbelltown, District Cooperative Society was formed with a patient care plan where people could subscribe to a cooperative plan to fund medical aircraft flights, and similarly air ambulance flights as well. So as I said, John Sword was forced to return to concentrate on buses, and Midland Scottish Air Ferries folded, but it was taken over by another bus operator, this time from Newcastle, a guy called George Nicholson, who formed Northern Scottish Airways, also based at Renfrew and flying out to the Western Isles. And that service was complemented by Hillman Airways down in Essex, connecting to Renfrew with a London-Liverpool-Belfast service a couple of times a week. And although Northern Scottish Airlines would add Lewis in the Outer Hebrides to its routes, that route was pioneered by Ted Fresson. So the first services to Skye were flown to an airfield near Loch Brittle, which is on the southern part of Skye. And the reason that was chosen, I don't know whether you can make out, there's a big beach with a field behind it, so it had a nice big flat area, but also the loch provided an approach route along the southwesterly direction, which was where most of the prevailing winds were, without having to fly over the Coolins. And not long after that, radio transmission facilities were added at Glasgow, which greatly helped the location finding. And then services to Barra started in '36. And I've got here some numbers that compare the equivalent travel by other means to the aircraft. So if you wanted to take the ferry and the train, you'd have to leave Castle Bay in Barra at 3:15 a.m. in the morning. It would arrive at Oban just after lunch. You then have a 117-mile train ride through Stirling to Glasgow. So you've got best part of a day's travel. If you could afford the £4 airfare, you could take off from the beach at Barra and be in Glasgow less than 2 hours later. And Isla was added not long after in a triangular route, so Glasgow, Isla to Barra. So this picture at the top there is John Sword's fleet in front of the 3 old hangars at Renfrew. More of these aircraft later. But the original site of the airport, so these are the 3 hangars here, if I'm pointing at the right bit, with the main runway that was built later. This is where this set of runways sits now in relation to the modern Glasgow airport, so it's just across the river. It's not quite the same site. The modern airport was created by the RAF at Abbots Inch, and it's where the modern airport now is. But when the RAF moved into Stornoway, they ripped up the airfield that Ted Fresson had paid for, but had never used because the war came before he could start to use it. So I'll talk more about this later, but after the Labour election victory just after the end of World War II, the independent Scottish Airlines were subsumed into British European Airways. And in many instances, that marked a decline in the air services provided in the Western Isles and in the Northern Isles, as we'll come on to, because they didn't learn from pioneers like John Sword, Nicholson, and Fresson. And in '64, Loganair started to carry the newspapers from Glasgow to Stornoway, and operated for the next 10 years without one single missed delivery, which is quite an achievement. And the station manager at Barra retired in 1980. She'd worked for 5 different airlines. So now, moving a bit closer to home, I have to say I'm a little bit nervous because I'm sure some of you know more about this than I do. I'm hoping you'll learn at least something, if only not to come out and listen to me talk again. But I'll start talking about more local aviation services now. So Ted Fresson created Highland Airways with considerable support from local businesses, the newspapers we've heard about, but also McRae and Dick, which was the motor factors in Inverness. I see there's Air Road to the Isles out for sale there. If you've not got it, get it. It's a brilliant read. He served with the Royal Flying Corps during World War I, then moved out to China where he built some aircraft, some from kits from other manufacturers, some he designed himself. And he started off by scouting various sites in Orkney when he flew to Kirkwall for the first time in his Moth. He wanted to store the aircraft overnight, so he managed to persuade Shearer's, the coal depot, to store his aircraft there, which is what it looks like now. It's just by the bus station. It doesn't look quite as posh as it did then, but they obviously gave him a great service. So that's the reason why we're here. The first regular service came on the 8th of May, so the anniversary of that was Monday. And you may have seen Loganair's commemorative flight as well, which is quite nice to see, and Richard Fresson getting involved. So a statue which seems to be based on that flight now has an ignominious place within the baggage carousel at Inverness Airport. It used to be out on the hard standing, which was a much better place for it to be. But you could get from Inverness to London in 3.5 hours. It doesn't take much longer than that now if you factor in check-in and security and everything else, with aircraft that fly 6 times faster than the Dragon would have done. And Fresson complained that the local support initially was lukewarm, and that's partly because some of the local dignitaries had interest in the shipping companies, and they thought that the aircraft would reduce the amount of time that people stayed in the islands and reduce the amount of people using the boats to get to the islands. He wasn't the only person flying in the northeast. Eric Gandadower set up an operation for Aberdeen. Gandadower's interesting. He witnessed Blériot's landing at Dover Castle when he flew across the Channel. He also witnessed Trygve Van's flight. So obviously he had got the aviation bug. So Gandadower's first services were from Aberdeen to Glasgow. But they carried an average of only 3 passengers each time, and soon lost a lot of money. They had income of about £8.15 over that period against costs of about £450, so clearly not a sustainable business. So Fresson and Gandadower came up with a verbal agreement to split the services. Gandadower would fly from Aberdeen, and Fresson would fly from Inverness. But Gandadower soon started to cross over that agreed barrier. And things were made worse when the Maybury report in 1939 suggested that competition was a bad thing and awarded a lot of the routes that Fresson had pioneered to Gandadower. But while Fresson had challenges from one of his contemporaries in the region, he got a crucial help from from John Sword across on the west coast. It was mentioned that the Monospar crashed and was out of action. So John Sword lent him an aircraft, a Foxmoth, and a pilot, Captain Coleman. And Fresson says in his book that without that assistance, Highland Airways would have folded. And Fresson had an astute business sense in some cases. He arranged for the North of Scotland Steam Navigation Company to become a shareholder in Highland Airways, and persuaded LMS to have a co-booking system with the airline that allowed passengers to book on both the train and the aircraft. So I think if you read the book, you get the impression that Fressen's real ambition was to connect the islands of the Orkney Islands together rather than necessarily with just the mainland. And he always thought that Orkney embraced aviation more quickly than, for instance, those in the Shetland Islands. And that's evidenced by the efforts to which some of the locals went to create landing strips. So in Westray, Sandy and Stronsay, walls were dismantled to provide landing runs for the aircraft. Then in 1937, services to Fair Isle were extended, and then Stroma in 1938. And that was made possible by the inhabitants levelling a massive amount of moorland by hand. Quite an achievement. And it was suggested that the air service is more regular and reliable because they were more or less susceptible to the weather. If the ferries were stopped because of waves or winds, if there was a 15-minute weather window, the aircraft could take off and perform its duty when the ferries were stuck on the jetty. My colleague, Professor Donna Heddle, who runs the Institute for Northern Studies here in Kirkwall, back in 2009 did an evaluation of the social impact of aviation services. And her finding was that it was the advent of the inter-island services that were of more importance than the link to the mainland. So especially with infant mortality, so children under 1 year, there was a massive leap in lives saved. And our family is a testament to that. So that's my grandfather, my grandmother, and that's my uncle, who had been taken to hospital in Glasgow. So as I mentioned, Fressen thought that the Shetlanders didn't embrace aviation in the same way. And if you look at the connecting flights within Shetland, they never matched the extent or frequency that happened in Orkney. And he was undercut on the mail run by Gander Dower of Aberdeen Airways, which later became Allied Airways. And due to a curious regulation whereby if you installed a radio station at an airport for your own use, that automatically made that airport open to anybody who wanted to come there. So Fressen, by investing in that, allowed Gander Dower then to be able to use the airfield at Sunborough. So by his own good work and his own good money, he opened up the airport to his competitor. And the airfield at Sunborough was developed before World War II and is in such a state that at the commencement it was immediately operational with Gloucester Gladiators defending the airspace there. And most of the inter-island flights happen from Tingwall, which is much closer to Lerwick, so much better for air ambulance and doesn't have the complications of the commercial services and the oil and gas helicopters going in and out. And Tingwall was constructed by the local detachment of Royal Engineers. And similarly to Orkney, the local residents who wanted aviation did it themselves. So in Papastua, all 6 of the island's men created an airstrip themselves, so that the aircraft could land there from 1969 onwards. So that's up until the war. Now a bit more on nationalisation. So the first part of that was the amalgamation of Highland Airways and Northern Scottish Airways, which is what Midland Scottish Airways had become, to form Scottish Airways, who were based at Renfrew. So it brought resilience, but it also reduced independence. So Scottish Airways also included London Midland Scottish and McBrain's. And United Airways had the backing of Whitehall Securities, which was part of the Pearson organisation, which was an investment company. And that led to some not so good decisions, as I'll come on to in a minute. So with nationalisation came what was called a licensing committee, established following the Maybury report. And that was far-reaching, and elements of it still exist in the way that air transport and general aviation operations are regulated today, and basically laid the foundation for the Civil Aviation Authority, the National Air Traffic Service, and airport groups like Highlands and Airlands airports. We were talking at the break about how some of the safety that we saw, or lack of safety that we saw in the film, couldn't happen today. Leaving an aircraft empty with the engines running, you couldn't do today. And I mentioned that this is one of the Dragons that crashed at Rousey. My grandfather was flying it. He said he was flying into land, and the wind stopped, so it dropped. Landed on the trees. You can see it bent one wing, and the passengers got out by ladder. 3 days later, it was on the jetty back at Kirkwall, and flying within 3 days of the accident happening. That would never happen today. So the adjudication of the Air Travel Licensing Authority, the ATLA, which followed the Maybury report, didn't sit well with Fresson. He didn't like his independence or his judgment being questioned. But the heart of it was to make aviation safer, and that competed routes might compromise safety. But competition, as we know in the modern world, can be good. It's led to lower fares, but also has led to a drop in safety. So it removed Scottish Airways' authority to fly from Aberdeen, leaving it to Allied Airways. And there's a lovely story between Adam Smith, who flew for Highland Airways, and Eric Starling, who flew for Allied Airways. Each was under pressure to fly no matter what the weather, to the point where it became dangerous. So the both of them, in the morning when they looked out the window and saw the weather, would by mutual agreement decide whether it was too bad to fly, and if so, they would adjourn down the pub for the day and have another look the following day. So they were not in direct competition in a dangerous manner. So as I mentioned, BAA was formed following the Labour government formation in 1945. A new Air Minister, Lord Winster, announced the state organisations, of which British European Airways would incorporate the Scottish routes. For a variety of reasons, and they're well documented, they didn't really work. In the first year, the cost to the taxpayer was £10 million, and that's in 1946 pounds, not current pounds, with a reduction in service. So you got a worse service for lots more money. The side effect of that was that it also prohibited the activities of charter airlines and independents. So the likes of Freddie Laker and Davidson at British Caledonian, who in their early airlines fought against the licensing authority to be granted routes and passengers. So there's a lot of suspicion that the Scottish division of BEA was just an intention to salve the egos of the locals, but actually do nothing. And Lord Polwarth alleged that not a single BEA director had ever visited Scotland. And to add insult to injury, Fresson was sacked by BEA later, and with some justification viewed this as public theft. He was not given any compensation for the work or the effort he'd put in to create the success that was the Northern Scottish Air Routes. And because they didn't listen to people like Fresson and Sword and Nicholson, they lost all of that experience and that know-how and that lessons learned the hard way, and turned a profitable network into a loss-making service. But they wouldn't let them go, so BA clung to these routes. They wouldn't allow others to fly them, and conceded that what they thought were third-level routes for example, from Glasgow Tiree, were eventually handed over to others, but only following the formation of British Airways. And it had been preceded by a proposal to take over Loganair and equip it with 3 Trilanders for use on routes to Campbellton, Isla, Tiree and Barra. I love this sticker. My father collected it from somewhere. If you look at the tagline around the outside, it says, BEA takes you there and brings you back. I think that's pretty much the minimum you expect from an airline. And if that's the best marketing you can come up with, I think you're in serious trouble. One of the things that BEA did try to do, which is now commonplace, is what's called integrated services. So they would have an aircraft flying, for example, Inverness to Kirkwall, which had just done Liverpool to Inverness. So it's what is done now. Aircraft don't just fly one route all day long. They are connected. So the aircraft you get on at Edinburgh might have just come in from Milan and you'll be going to Brussels. That aircraft will then come back to Gatwick and then might go somewhere else. So these aircraft are programmed to optimize their usage over a given period. But that was probably optimistic given the vagaries of the aircraft at the time, and it resulted in unreliability of service. And Fresson bemoaned this, that in a heavy-handed way, BEA had set up its own department for these operations without knowing what they were doing, really. And a byproduct of that was that because they were losing so much money, they tried to recoup it by landing charges, which then had a knock-on effect on passenger numbers and services. And rightly or wrongly, Fresson also claimed that the failure to reinstigate the inter-island services and the island to the mainland services was one of the reasons responsible for depopulation of the islands after World War II. So I have to wait until '67 before Loganair revived the inter-island services from Kirkwall to Stronsay, Sandy and North Ronaldsay. And in doing so, they became the launch customer, what we call now the launch customer for the Islander, and use it for fare-paying passengers. So Loganair was taken over by the National Bank of Scotland in 1968, which seems to have been quite an innovative bank. They'd set up the first mobile bank in Lewis and extended that to Orkney with the introduction of the boat bank. So I guess in some way, the takeover of an airline was almost a logical progression. So one last thing on nationalisation. When I grew up watching aeroplanes in the late 70s, early 80s, the likes of Danair and British Caledonian and Laker were prevalent. And they had survived despite the machinations of the state-owned airlines. And Danair obviously operated services into Inverness. And as Moya already mentioned, Peter Clegg, who used to work for Danair, has been instrumental in cataloguing a lot of the history that I've talked about today in a series of books. And similarly, Ian Hutchinson and Eric Starling have also written some excellent books. So now, just quickly cover some of the personalities. So people like Fresson and Sword and Nicholson were visionaries and pioneers. They saw a requirement, they worked out how to meet it. But the people they recruited were similarly adventurous. Already mentioned Winnie Drinkwater, so the top photograph, that's Winnie Drinkwater here. That's Jimmy Orrell, and that's my grandfather. One of the reasons my grandfather claimed for leaving Midland Scottish was he hated the uniform, which, considering he later served for 7 years in the RAF, is a bit of an interesting claim. So as I said earlier, I can't find anywhere in the world where a woman was captain of a commercial flight before Winnie Drinkwater flew that in '33. She learned to fly at the age of 17 in the Scottish Flying Club, as I mentioned earlier, and she became Scotland's first women licensed engineer. So she was licensed to fix aircraft. And this combination of pilot and engineer was common, because if these aircraft were away from base and they broke down, it was usually only the pilot on hand who could fix them. So the combination was worthwhile. And as I mentioned, my grandfather left de Havilland to join Midland Scottish Air Ferries, and brought with him Noel Mavrocordato. I can't quite see the picture up there, but I think the guy in the uniform, the sort of white flying overalls is Jimmy Orrell. The guy standing next to him in the tie is Noel Mavrocordato, who had his own personal Bristol fighter from World War I as a flyabout. And he had a Mercedes or some similar sports car. And Jimmy Orrell later became a test pilot for Avro, including the first flights of the Lancastrian and the Shackleton. And that's Jimmy Orrell here, outside a caravan on Renfrew Airport. When my grandfather joined Midland Scottish, he'd just got married. So this is my grandmother here in their first marital home, this caravan on Renfrew Airport. So like my wife Heather here, she's probably an aviation widow just the same way. And When You Drink Water is sitting bottom left in uniform as well. And then there's a Captain C.B. Wilson, who flew in Shetland, who was a World War I pilot and later became a test pilot for Lockheed. And part of the reason these skills were needed was because they didn't have the modern aids and navigation that we expect today. They had a stopwatch and a compass. And trying to find Fair Isle in a low overcast with just a stopwatch and a compass requires incredible judgment. Even moving them on the ground could be tricky depending on the direction of the wind, with risk of them being blown over. Even if you tethered them down, the loads through the tether to the wing could cause structural damage. And both Preston and my grandfather told of takeoff being in a strong wind when the ground crew let go. So you'd point it into wind, hold it down, let go, and the aircraft would go straight up. And then you point it in the direction you want to go to. And just getting people on the aircraft was difficult. They had to strategically arrange fuel bowsers and fire tenders to act as breakers for the wind. So finally, on the history bit, some of the aircraft, which as an aircraft designer is probably my interesting bit. So just to contrast, this is John Sword's fleet at Renfrew, and we have the Highland Airways flight at Wideford, which is just up the hill from the modern airport where the cairn is on the lay-by. So we've got some Foxmoths. What we've got next, there's an ordinary Moth, a couple of Dragons, an airspeed ferry, an Avro 10. And then predominantly in Orkney, it was the Dragon Rapide and the Dragon. So start off with John Sword predominantly. His first aircraft was an Avro 610, which was a license-built version of the Fokker 10. As an aerodynamicist, I really hate this. It's just a wing stuck to a fuselage with no aerodynamic detailing whatsoever. I mean, it works, but it's a bit Heath Robinson. It had 3 engines, so it was rugged and reliable. And eventually, that wing was taken and integrated into a fuselage properly. So that's the same wing in a different fuselage, and that became the Avro 642. John Sword operated 1, and only 2 were built, so not a great financial success. So Foxmoth was used quite a lot by John Sword. It's essentially a tiger moth's wings and empennage added to a new fuselage. So the pilot sits in an exposed cockpit up here with the passengers in a cabin underneath. And we saw in the film the monospar, designed by a Swiss engineer, a graduate of Imperial College, who had previously worked for Beardmore, but he came up with a novel design. So you can just see that this one spar goes all the way through the wing, and then this detailing here, which you can see quite clearly in the film, gives it torsional rigidity, so the wing doesn't twist, so you don't need a second spar. So it's a single spar, so the aircraft was called a monospar. Obviously very useful because it had a useful payload, folding wings, and the reliability of 2 engines. Another curiosity, really, and they're not really prevalent. I think there are only 4 built. The airspeed ferry was designed for Sir Alan Cobham, who is also one of the featured in one of the chapters on the DVD for his Cobham Circus. So Tiltman designed it really as a big cabin and a small petrol tank because it was doing short experience hops. John Sword bought 2 of them, and the first down payment for it was his own 6.5 litre Bentley motor car. So Airspeed were open to obviously doing some good deals. And the flat fuselage at the top here was useful for standing on. It's reinforced. You could stand on it to operate the 3rd engine, which otherwise would have been quite high up off the ground. But the aircraft ubiquitous with the early airlines was the de Havilland Dragon. Incredibly, first flight was just after 4 months of design and construction. So from first idea to first flight was just 4 months. I spent 15 years working on the A380, so things have changed somewhat. And I'll come on to it later, but the payload size, so the ratio of the weight of the passengers and fuel to the weight of the aircraft empty was massive. And there's been nothing really like it since. So an attempt to come up with a more modern version took elements of the DH-86, which is a 4-engined elliptical winged aircraft, and applied it to a more Dragon-like fuselage, and the result was the Dragon repeater. It's got trousered undercarriage, it's got lovely elliptical wings. 728 were built, and again, like the Dragon, nothing really has replaced it. And I mentioned United Airways had a shareholding with Whitehead Securities. They owned Spartan Airways, and they were instrumental in creating an aircraft called the Spartan Cruiser. So this is this cruiser. It's maybe a design only a mother could love, but it was only used on the west coast. So it was landing on the beach at Barra. It was being used in Skye, and the all-metal fuselage didn't take too well to the saltwater environment. So they were scrapped by the RAF when they were taken into service after the start of the Second World War because of the resulting ingress of saltwater. So just a little segue into the Brabazon Committee. Some of you will be more familiar with than others, but the Brabazon Committee was set up during World War II to look at what aircraft Great Britain should build in anticipation of peace and to compete with the Americans. It was chaired by Lord Brabazon and came up with 5 different types of aeroplane, of which Type 2 was intended to replace the Rapide and the Dakota. I'll choose a picture here because it kind of links some things together. So this is the Bristol Brabazon, which was a result of Type 5, I think it was, flying over Farnborough. So this is what's called Cody's tree. It's the tree that Cody, the guy who did the first flight in the UK, tied his aircraft to conduct engine trials. This might have been Cody's tree at the time. There is now a fiberglass replica at the Kinetic site, which is now the company that runs the Farnborough site. And these are the famous black sheds at Farnborough, which have had some remodeling done by aircraft landing on them inadvertently in the past. And one of the more curious decisions was to use the Junkers 52 on the Scottish routes. It was a good aeroplane in its time, but it was already obsolete by the 1940s. But there were some surplus ones. Although they were cheap, BA spent £12,000 converting each of them, which is, in today's money is a huge amount of money. But the main problem was that their BMW engines, most of which were time expired by the time they got here, were not reliable. There was a plan to replace them with Pratt & Whitney Wasps, as were in the Dakota, but not done. The main problem was that these engines required a very specific starter, and the destinations that these aircraft flew to were not provided with that starter. So if an engine stopped, it stayed stopped. There was no starting it until you could get a starter to it, which meant that in the short period where they were used, the reliability dropped from nearly 100% down to 60 to 70%, and it wasn't long before the Dakota replaced it. And hopefully I don't need to talk to really about here the Dakota, one of the most famous aircraft in aviation history. In BA service, it was called the Pioneer. Obviously, it was described by Eisenhower as one of the weapons that won the war. And then another de Havilland aircraft, the Dove, which was another design for Brabazon's Type 2 designation. The trouble was it was a good aircraft, but it had a very high purchase price compared with the Rapide and 50% greater operating costs, which meant that the independent airlines couldn't really use it. So it's no surprise that most of them were used by BEA. And then the Heron was a larger 4-engine version of that. So they replaced the Rapides on many of the routes. I've got a quote there from Eric Starling? One of the pilots, I can't remember now, who said if you could see the seagull's knees, then the water on the beach was shallow enough to land on. I don't think you'll see that in many flight manuals today. And then another aircraft that came out of Brabazon was the Herald. Originally a piston engine version with 4 piston engines replaced by a turboprop, the Dart Herald. And these were used on the Scottish routes. It's really a workhorse, one of much underrated aircraft. And after the introduction of TV reception in the islands, apparently over 8,000 sets were flown to Kirkwall from Aberdeen. And then replacing the Herald was the Viscount. It's a notable aircraft in British aviation history. It's the world's first turboprop commercial airliner. It sold well in the US, which was unusual, and was used by airlines all over the world. And it resulted in as a result of a change to the Brabazon Type 2. So Type 2A was a piston engine version, which ended up with the Ambassador and the Herald, and the Brabazon 2B was the turboprop, which ended up in the Viscount. So from quite a lovely looking aircraft to some less lovely looking aircraft. Functional, I think, is probably the politest description. So the Short Skyvan was built by Shorts as a private venture in '59. Could carry a 2-ton payload in a box-like section, so it really was a shed with wings on it. And it sold 70, which was quite successful, so Shorts decided to build something a bit bigger and a bit more modern, which resulted in the 330, which had the same cabin cross-section and the same structural concept. And then the 360 was an enlarged version of it. But neither of the latter two were really very successful. They replaced the de Havilland Twin Otter on the Barrow run, but they had very severe limitations on crosswinds, and where it could only use the longest runway at Barrow. And one of the things that if you talk to Andy Smith and other people at Logan Air now, one of the reasons that they don't like these types of aircraft on the beach is because of retractable undercarriage. There's a lot more places where salt water can get in and do some damage, whereas the fixed undercarriage Twin Otter does not. So Twin Otter came back, a bit like its UK cousin, De Havilland Canada has produced some fantastic aircraft. They're a little more rugged and a little more utilitarian than the UK equivalents, but they do a job and they do it very well. They're safe and they're strong, but they're also heavier, and some of the simplicity in the aircraft results in a decrease in performance. But very, very useful aircraft. And the Loganair still operate 3 of them, although they've been re-engined with turboprop engines, and 2 of them are owned by Highlands and Highlands Airports, leased back to Loganair. And then aircraft which you'll be more than familiar with, the Britten Norman Islander, which still has a link to de Havilland. Mr. Britten and Mr. Norman were both de Havilland apprentices who designed their own aircraft. The Trilander was less of a success. It had 75% commonality with its twin-engine counterpart, but the fatigue load on the tail meant that I don't think there are any examples flying now because they've all exceeded their fatigue life. But as with the Rapide and with the Dragon, they can operate with single pilot operation, which really makes a difference to the economics of the aircraft. And then, because I'm an academic and an aircraft designer, I can't. So this graph shows the maximum takeoff weight in kilograms of the aircraft increasing this way. And here we have what's called the payload fraction. So this is what I mentioned earlier. It's the percentage of the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft, of which is payload. So if you have a high percentage, that means you can get a lot more stuff in that pays money, passengers and freight. A low fraction means that the percentage of the aircraft at takeoff that gives you revenue is very small. So you want to be this end of the graph. And you can see you have the Foxmoth, the Dragon, the Twin Otter. Down here we have the Monospar, the Shorts aircraft. The thing that I really need to check is the Junkers 52 comes out up here and the Dakota comes out down here. So I need to check my numbers because that just doesn't seem right. But you can see most of the successful aircraft have been up in this part of the graph. So, and finally, how that connects to the future. So it's already been mentioned, I helped co-create the Sustainable Aviation Test Environment project with Linda Johnston at Highlands and Highlands Airports. You may have seen the hangar being erected at the airport. So the original iteration of that project started off 2.5 years ago with 5 major aircraft partners. So Ampere here with a Cessna 337, we're looking at electric aircraft. Zero Avia had their hydrogen aircraft. Loganair, we're looking at sustainable aviation fuel. Wind Racers have a large capacity, 100 kilogram payload, 1,000 kilometer range UAV. And then a little company called Flarebright have a little payload delivery device which can run in GPS denied areas. And the other partners mentioned here, so EMEC especially were very helpful in understanding how a test environment can be set up in a location like Orkney. So one of the reasons we chose Orkney is because of the accessibility to all types of renewable energy. There's no point setting up a low carbon aircraft if you have to build another nuclear power station or coal-fired power station to run it. So you have an embarrassment of renewable energy in the islands, including hydrogen production on ED. And so that's why. And Kirkwall Airport, although it's less busy than places like Heathrow, it has everything representative of a modern operational airport. It has scheduled airline services, it has general aviation, it has oil and gas helicopters, pretty much everything. So it's truly representative of the modern aviation system. So we were looking at use cases. Rather than pushing technology on a community, we wanted to understand what the community wanted from that technology and then try to work out how to meet it. and looking at the airport, the digital infrastructure, and the supply chain as well. So you probably have seen the hangar. So inside we have charging locations. There's also one in the Loganair hangar, I believe, as well, because we put it in there for Ampere. There's some offices, and there is a connection point for electrolyzer for hydrogen. And Ampere flew there 2 years ago, nearly now. So Ampere's hybrid electric aircraft, and then Windracer's drone flew some flights for Royal Mail, including up to North Ronaldsay, out to Fair Isle, and up to Shetland. So these were the flights in the first phase. So we had from Wick to Kirkwall, out to some of the outer islands, and then up to Shetland. These are the flights planned for the next phase, some of which will happen this summer, including possibly a flight from Kirkwall to Bergen by Windracer's autonomous aircraft, which I think will be the first civil autonomous international flight. And just very quickly, a couple of points about Ampere's aircraft. I was seconded as chief engineer to Ampere for 18 months and was responsible for getting the aircraft across to the UK, rebuilt, certificated, and then conducting the flight tests. And Neil, who's in the audience, and Sophie, who was with the SAPE project at that point, looked after me grandly at the airport, so thank you very much for that. So here we've got a Cessna 337. The back engine is the original internal combustion. The front engine has been replaced by an electric motor, and this is the battery underneath. So inside that front compartment, I don't know whether you can make out this silver bit here, is the inverter. So we have an AC motor and a DC battery. You need to convert one to the other. The black donut is the electric motor, which sits just behind here. So we've taken a lot of cast iron out of the front of the aircraft, which means that the centre of gravity moved backwards. Ideally, we would have wanted to move the battery forward, but the nose gear got in the way. So the only way to restore the centre of gravity was to add some ballast into the nose. That's the first time I have knowingly added weight to an aircraft. Normally you're desperate to get it out of So the aircraft arrived from Los Angeles in a shipping container at Wick. We put it back together again, and it flew first from Wick to Kirkwall, arriving on the 6th of August. When leaving Kirkwall, it was intended to fly all the way down to Exeter, but the transponder went US, so we had to get it replaced at Perth, then flew non-stop from Perth to Exeter, and then from Exeter to Newquay to Land's End. So by flying from Wick, which of course is John O'Groats Airport, we flew from John O'Groats to Land's End. And then lastly, hydrogen aircraft. So some of you may have seen recently the Project Fresson was being pursued by Cranfield Aerospace Solutions. They have now formally merged with Britten-Norman, so it'd be interesting to see what that entity looks like in the future. And Project Heart, which Highlands Islands Airports and Loganair are already involved in, is looking at an autonomous freight version of the Islander for operations. So we've gone from pioneers to aircraft of the future. And I'll finish on something a bit personal. This is my grandfather in front of a dragon at Wideford in 1935. That's me in front of the Cessna 337 2 years ago. So it may have taken us, 86 years, but one of the Ray boys was back in Orkney playing with airplanes. So just to conclude, we've talked about the pioneers. They achieved some incredible results. They achieved reliable, affordable air services. And I think it's true to say that what they set up is still the benchmark for modern air services. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting talk, and so obviously very exciting prospects for the future, and we
Absolutely.
watch with interest to see what happens. But equally interesting talk about what happened so long ago. So, does anyone have any questions? Right, well, I'll start off because my father used to talk about there being the airfield at Howe in Stromness instead of Cumminess. I believe that was Ganderdower.
Right?
So it looks as if you don't know anything about that one.
No. As I said, from the family conversations that we've had, but also the book that Peter Clegg put together. I'm sure there are people here that know far more than me about a lot of this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was clear that Ganderdower was an interesting character. I think in some cases he had better business sense than Fresson did. I wasn't worried about treading on people's toes. But maybe if they'd been grown-ups and played together nicely, then we could have come up with better things.
Yes, and I seem to have covered the subject very well.
People want to get out into the sunshine if there's any bits left.
Yes, so that's all.
Magnus Slater, I fly for Loganair now, in fact. What visitors in terms of SATE have you got this summer? Is there a Dornier rumoured to be coming up?
We were hoping so. It looks now that that's unlikely. It appears that the approvals for longer distance flights are going to be harder to achieve than they thought. So at the moment they've got just A to A, so they're limited to Kemble, back to Kemble, within Kemble. To get they will never ever be given, so the ferry flight we did with Ampere, as I said, was 418 nautical miles, they will never be given that. So they would have to do lots of short hops, which means lots of infrastructure changes, which makes it very expensive. If you've not read the accident report from the Malibu crash at Cranfield, it's worth reading that, and then that gives some indication of why the current challenges exist.
An airplane like that with basically is storing hydrogen in the fuselage at the moment, so how would you foresee that coming outside the fuselage? I mean, the island is shown with large tanks under the wings, or I've heard that there's roof rack arrangements potentially with hydrogen storage.
These are all really challenging questions, and nobody has an answer for them yet. Hydrogen is the smallest molecule we know. It's a single atom molecule, so it will leak from everything. There's nothing you can put it in that it won't leak from. If you know that, then you've got to allow for it to escape from somewhere. You can't let it pool in an area where it might become flammable. So sticking it in a pod on the wing is great, but if it blows up, you take the wing with it. That's aside from all the asymmetric drag and stuff that it causes. You know better than I do the controllability of an Islander with a single engine out. Yes, so to get these aircraft certificated is going to be a massive challenge. There are no current standards that cover these aircraft. And one of the things we're doing is working with the Civil Aviation Authority to look at the new things like certification standards that cover the aircraft. So things like maximum climb rate in an engine out situation. If you've got a hybrid aircraft like the Dornier or Amperes, or even a singlet, so Ampere have a version of the Cessna Caravan, which has a diesel engine linked to an electric motor driving a single propeller. So it's a single power source, but you've got two different motors driving it. Is that a single engine or is it a twin engine? Because the answer to that determines your things like single engine climb rates and other stuff, as you know. And if you don't know the answer to that, you can't design a clean sheet aircraft. So all these retrofits are currently the only thing we can do because they're one of a kind, and you can do it on a case-by-case basis.
I guess you could relate it to a helicopter with a single rotor and gearboxes with two engines.
Yeah, but that's a separate certification standard. So there's a massive piece of work looking at what other legislation and standards exist and try and pull them all together into a new certification standard so we can design these things from a clean sheet. Because the only way we're going to get the best benefit from them is by doing a clean sheet. Good though the Islander is, re-engineering it is not the way forward. We need a carbon airframe with other things. So with aerodynamics designed today rather than 70 years ago. But no, there is no silver bullet. Batteries are too heavy. Hydrogen's, nobody's worked out how to do. So if you're changing a fuel tank in the hangar, how do you make sure that the gas that escapes from the fuel tank doesn't accumulate in the top of the hangar and where the lights are? So there's all sorts of operational things as well.
Thank you.
No problem. But to go back to your question, ZeroAvia probably won't be coming. Wind racers are coming back with their drone. There's a company called Arc Aerosystems who have got a large four-rotor quadcopter that will fly at Wick, possibly here later. And there's another big drone company that's talking to us about flight testing later in the year. I don't think we'll see hybrid air vehicles, airship in Orkney anytime soon, sadly, but that would be quite a sight to see, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Obviously, as Arcadians, we think we're very unique, but one thing that really is unique are is the very short distance to the outer islands in terms of flight distance. So does that leave a possibility that electric aircraft could work? Because the range required is very little. Obviously, there's still potential for instrument approaches and in bad weather and things, but it seems like electric could work on such a short route, maybe with battery swaps when they return or some such thing. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you bring up 2 points we came across when working with Ampere. So it's limited to VFR, but we have to have enough juice in it to be able to divert to an IFR landing, and that means either Sunborough or possibly Wick, but probably Inverness. So for a 15-minute flight, we have to provide an hour's worth of juice, which means that battery is at least 4 times bigger than it needs to be for those short flights. So unless there is a guarantee that you can fly VFR all the time, or the rules change, then that perfect sub-regional route for an electric aircraft is not implementable at the moment, just because of the regulations. The swappable battery bit is interesting because as soon as you have a swappable battery, that's then a line replaceable unit. It has to be replaced by a licensed engineer rather than a refueler. So the process has to change. But I mean, it's one of the things we found out with Ampere that yes, we could do the inter-islands okay, we still couldn't carry the payload that would make it economic on the Cessna 337. With a bigger aircraft we might be able to. But it was that diversion requirement that was the real killer.
Yeah, it seems like there's an awful lot of, these traditional regulations that are really not up to scratch for modern thinking and, for innovation in the 21st century. I mean, if you go to a home build fair like in Oshkosh and places, there are dozens and dozens of aircraft that just have to prove they can fly, and they're all really clever, and that it almost feels like we need that innovation rather than lots of regulations to stop innovation. Yes.
From bitter personal experience, Europe is a much more highly regulated environment than the US. An example is that the best way to have got Ampere's aircraft onto the UK register was under the conditions, experimental conditions. But the weight limit for that is 2,000 kilograms, and the Cessna 337 fully loaded is 2,250 kilograms. So we couldn't do it an E-condition, so we had to do it under a foreign aircraft exemption approval. In the US, you could fly an A380 under experimental conditions if you proved what you were doing was correct. So the landscape is more open to innovation in the US, but they also have more safety issues than we do. There must be a happy medium in between so that we can promote innovation, but keep it safe at the same time. And one of the things we're doing in the current phase of the project is working with the CAA to look at what the future of airspace management might be. So looking at towards unsegregated airspace where drones and manned aircraft might fly together, with the onus on the drone to keep everything safe, get out of the way when they need to. That's one way we can promote innovation, but it's got to be done safely. So that relies on things like detect and avoid. You can demonstrate detect quite easily, but how do you demonstrate avoid without endangering an aircraft? By trying to prove that you can avoid it. But I think you're right, there has to be a step change in that approach. Otherwise, as you say, some of these technologies they'll fall by the wayside just because of possibly unnecessary regulation. But I have to say, the CAA and the innovation part of the CAA have been very willing partners within the project. They're willing to listen. It's the first time I've had a two-way conversation with the CAA. So normally you suggest something, you throw it over a fence, and it either gets chewed up or returned to you. So having a two-way conversation is really positive. And we're discussing some of these issues.
Thank you. Now another question over there.
The Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy used Rapids as short communication aircraft in the 50s, but they called them the Domini. Was it in fact the same aircraft?
As far as I know, the Rapide was, the Domini was a Rapide. It might have had a different internal fit for military use. As far as I know, it's the same aircraft. And then confusingly, they called the de Havilland 125 a Domini as well.
I think. Yes.
Neil.
Hi there. You knew there would be a question from me in this one, but
Is that time? I must go.
I'm going back to history rather than the future. I've been interested in the history of Kirkwall Airport for a long time, and I'd completely forgotten about Ganderdower. And it seems that, from what I've seen tonight, he was more a plagiarist rather than a pioneer. What actually happened to him? Why did he fail and Fresson succeeded, and we still remember him so much?
Good question. I think plagiarism might be a strong word. He certainly didn't worry about treading on toes in the same way that modern businessmen don't mind elbowing their way into a marketplace to achieve success. I don't think he understood aviation in the same way that Fresson did. And obviously they were all subsumed under Scottish Airways after the Maybury report. I might need to be corrected, but I think aviation wasn't really his first love. He was kind of forced to do it as a business, because I think I remember, but I think his true love was the theatre, and he wanted to be a theatre impresario, but that didn't pay any money, so he started an airline. He clearly had an interest in aviation because, as I say, he was at Dover Castle and saw Trigby Van, but I don't think he had the same passion for it, maybe, that Fresson and Sword did. So maybe when things got a bit tough, he hung his gloves up earlier than the other two wanted to. But, I mean, if you find out more, Neil, let me know, because I'm not entirely sure.
I think that's maybe it, is it? Yes, looks like it. Well, thank you again. That's been all extremely interesting, as I'm sure you can all agree, and I don't seem to get filled in on the details of things we knew little bits about, but so interesting to see all the pictures and so on. So, thank you again. Thank you very much. And let's
Thank you. Thank you.
Glasgow in the 50s, and they all got into the plane and all sat at the back, and the steward got over and said,